Welcome back to BNN News. As work continues on the natural gas pipeline through West Roxbury, so do the protests. Opponents are concerned about the local impact, but also the global effects of burning more fossil fuels. We'd like to welcome one of the clergy members arrested at the recent protests, the minister of Theodore Parker Church, Reverend Bancroft. Also with us is a climate change activist and one of the protest supporters from Bethel AME Church in Jamaica Plain, Reverend Mariama Hammond. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you.
I will start with Ann Bancroft because you're also with this, protest the pipeline movement here. What got you started?
I think what got me started was hearing about the idea of this pipeline going through a community with elementary schools, with elder homes, the size of the pipeline, the scope of the project. When I first heard about it, I thought, this can't be. This doesn't make any sense. Like, how would this? I drove around, I looked at what was considered to be the incineration zone, should anything happen. All these things were so startling and so alarming, and I thought, we can't not respond to this. We can't. So you start looking at, well, how are our public officials responding to it? What kind of information has been going around? We've hosted several teach-ins at Theodore Parker Church to try and educate ourselves and the public about what the risks are, what the situation is, what the needs are, what are we really looking at. And the more I learned about it, the more I thought, this isn't acceptable. There's nothing like this that exists anywhere in the country. There's no pipeline of this size that goes through a neighborhood, the likes of Boston neighborhood, the likes of that. It just makes no sense. So the more I learned, the more I felt, it was important to do something, to make some kind of statement. So civil disobedience is not our only action. There's a lot of letter writing going on. There's a lot of contacting and conversation and efforts to try and draw attention to it. At the end of the day, it has felt as though there was very little recourse other than responding this way. So.
Reverend Hammond, your church is in Jamaica Plain, a little farther away, the Reverend Bancroft, but what made you concerned about this?
Well, I'd been following the movement going on. I am deeply concerned about climate change. As a clergy person, it's really important that we think not just about the here and now, but also the future. And I think that there are really dangerous decisions that we're making for the future, and that's part of how we got to this. It was interesting, I was talking recently to a parishioner who's dealing with an addiction, right? And because of his addiction, he's made a lot of bad choices. And so we were talking through, how do we begin to deal with this so that he doesn't continue to make bad choices? Well, I think the same thing is true in climate change. We have an addiction to fossil fuels and oil. And because of that, we're making a lot of bad choices. And this is an example of one of those really bad choices that just doesn't make sense. It's not safe. And it's only taking us down a pathway that we already know is not good for us. So our church is exactly 2.15 miles from the pipeline. And what really got our congregation more concerned is that about a month ago, Spectra, the same exact company that's building this pipeline, had a pipeline in Pennsylvania that had an explosion, and it affected people up to 6 miles away. And so suddenly we started thinking, I had cared about the issue, but parishioners started talking to me and wanting to think about it, because our church, many of their homes are in the zone that could be directly affected if this experiment, because I think it is an experiment just to see if it will work, because they've never done it before. If it goes wrong, there can be a lot of damage in our local community, and I felt like we needed to get more engaged.
Reverend, I guess you're not very reassured by the government's, at least the regulators, talking about this pipeline. I know you're concerned about the pipeline going near an active quarry with explosions,
exactly.
and the federal regulators saying, don't worry, the pipeline's thick, it's underground, but you're not very...
It appears that the reason they're saying that is testing that's sort of within its own industry, right? So the industry calls on itself to regulate what may or may not be good for it. There's no independent study of safety here. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, I think in its history, has, the saying goes, they haven't met a pipeline they didn't like. I think they've only not approved 2 of them. I don't have any confidence that there's been any really careful research done from an independent organization about the reality of the safety of this. And unfortunately, what we see in places like San Bruno and in places like Pennsylvania is incidents of disaster that certainly wasn't anticipated, certainly wasn't planned, but happened nonetheless. And given that this is of such a scale that is, as I said, nowhere else in the country, I don't think there's a reason to have confidence that there's been any oversight that really assures us differently. And we know that the city of Boston, actually, Mayor Walsh, is engaged in a suit against Spectra right now. The city council has been in support of our position to disallow this construction to happen. Dedham is against it. It's a pretty amazingly opposed program to be going forward the way it is.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with opponents of the West Roxbury pipeline, Reverend Bancroft and Reverend Mariama White Hammond. I want to start back again with Reverend White Hammond. This is a time when we see all kinds of religious leaders talking about climate change as a global moral issue. Pope, I guess, this is something you have to look at this bigger picture.
Yeah, and I think the reality is I can't imagine that we would face a future where people can't breathe, where we learn to live with earthquakes and hurricanes. And I think it's hard for us because it feels so far away. But the other day I was at the Green Ribbon Commission, which is like the city's commission to look at climate. And we got a view of what Boston will look like in 60 years. There's some parts of the city that will live underwater or will have a major flooding at least once a month. That is not a future that is viable. It's not livable. People will die. And so I know we're not facing it now on the scale that we will down the line. But it is our job as clergy people to say that if we see an impending disaster, we've got to call people to shift directions. So I think that's why a lot of us are a lot more engaged. We're concerned, not just about the future. There are victims of climate change right now. I don't think the situation in Syria would be as bad as it was if there was not a major water crisis already happening. There are small islands like Tuvalu and Vanuatu that are not going to be livable potentially in the next 10 to 15 years. So even though we don't see all of those things right next to us, as people of faith, we've got to say that the human community, we have to protect all of them, and we've got to change for the people who are suffering now and for our grandchildren and future generations. It's just, we can't keep doing what we're doing.
Reverend Bancroft, what do you feel about how this wave of protests has been proceeding? Do you feel that this is a wave that's growing?
I think there is growing energy, actually. I was involved in the first wave of protests and civil disobedience last October. I was arrested with Chuck Collins and my colleague, Reverend Martha Niebank. And it sort of initiated a series of acts and protests over the fall while construction was still going on. And we saw over the winter an increasing number of people getting online with resistthepipeline.org and signing up to be trained and to be engaged in civil disobedience. I think because people are more and more actively aware of how dangerous this particular pipeline is, but also the ramifications of continuing fossil fuel industries and infrastructure. And the more people are feeling empowered and impassioned to get involved in ways that they hope will have an impact. And at this point, we're at one of those places, not unlike places we've witnessed in the past, where people feel the only choice is to act out actively against what is physically happening.
We should mention if people want to find out some more about what's going on in the future, there's a place that they can look that up.
Absolutely, resistthepipeline.org. There's lots of information on there. There's all kinds of stuff to learn, and there are ways to sign up to be involved and engage with us.
Thank you both very much, Reverend Bancroft.
Thank you.
And Reverend Mariama White Hammond.